Breaking news. The United States Supreme Court agreed to continue blocking a law that would have disenfranchised tens of thousands of Arizonans. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
Marc, the U.S. Supreme Court just issued a major decision in an Arizona election law case. In a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Arizona can require some voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. However, the court kept other suppressive parts of the law blocked. Marc, what does this mean?
You know, Arizona Republicans have been enacting these various voter suppression laws for years and years. And one of the iterations of this was a law, HB 2492. And today, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed that the main portions of that law remain blocked for 2024.
Marc, what's key to understand in this case is that Arizona has a bifurcated voter registration system. Now, in every state, you have a state-level voter registration form, and then there's also a nationwide federal voter registration form. For many years, Arizona has required that when you register to vote using the state form, you need to provide what's called documentary proof of citizenship. Basically, you have to prove that you're a U.S. citizen in order to vote. If you register to vote using the state form or the federal form and you provide proof of citizenship with your voter registration form, you're registered to vote and you are good to go. If you don't provide that proof of citizenship, but a county recorder is able to verify your citizenship using the Arizona Department of Transportation records, their version of the DMV, you're fully registered to vote and you can vote for all races. If there's not documentary proof of citizenship and the county recorder can't get that information from the Department of Transportation, it creates a bucket of what's known as federal-only voters. These are voters who have attested that they are a U.S. citizen under the penalty of perjury, but they haven't provided that documentary proof, but they're still able to vote only in federal elections, so for Congress, Senate, and President. But in 2022, Arizona Republicans passed a new law, HB 2492. One provision of the law says that if you register using the state form, but don't provide documentary proof of citizenship, your registration will be rejected, even if officials can verify your citizenship in other state databases like the Department of Transportation. This provision was previously blocked by the courts, but SCOTUS said today that it can go into effect.
So, Paige, you said something that I think people really need to understand, which is that Arizona already has this bifurcated system. And the reason they have this bifurcated system, as you allude to, is because they have been trying to figure out a theory to disenfranchise voters on sort of these grounds for the better part of a decade or more. The fact is, Arizona Republicans, even before the era of Donald Trump, even before the big lie and election denialism, Arizona Republicans were finding out creative ways to disenfranchise voters. We talked on earlier episodes, long time ago, Paige, you and I, about the Brnovich decision, right? And this was yet another sort of scheme they came up with, right? Where they vilified Latino voters to pass a law that the Department of Justice had refused to pre-clear, right? This was a law that when pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act was in place, would have violated federal law. And then after the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 was struck down, they passed an even stronger version of this law, which prohibits essentially the collection and return of mail-in ballots. And they did it because they thought it would disenfranchise Latino voters and Native American voters. And so, people need to understand the backdrop of this, which is that this is not Arizona Republicans trying to give good government. This is Arizona Republicans who have been on a more than a decade-long crusade to try to make it harder for an increasingly diverse group of American citizens, make it harder for those folks to vote.
And Marc, that's just further proven by these provisions of HB 2492 that were challenged. I want to talk about the other two provisions of HB 2492 that remain blocked because they would have immediately disenfranchised thousands of voters. So because these provisions remain blocked, but the documentary proof of citizenship requirement for registration went into effect, we're calling the SCOTUS ruling a mixed bag. So, number one, it wants to ban federal only voters from voting by mail in federal elections. Now, what you need to understand is that Arizona voters love to vote by mail. It's something like what, Mark? Over 80% of
Yeah,
Arizonans
it's
voted
80
by mail.
plus. It could be higher this time.
Right. Like Arizona loves to vote by mail. So if you ban federal only voters from voting by mail, you're most likely taking away the primary method that these people cast their ballots. Now, number two, the law wants to ban federal only voters from voting for president, not for Senate or for Congress, but only for president. And that's Mark strange. I would say weird, even. Like, there's no reason to single out the presidential race as the race to ban federal only voters from, unless you're really worried about your status as a potential swing state. And these bans for federal only voters on voting by mail and voting for president apply to both new and existing federal only voters. Now, over 30,000 Arizonans currently fall into this bucket of federal only voters. So we're talking about potential clear margins of victory in a race.
And Paige, that's why this ruling, as sort of mixed as it is so important. Because, look, would I have loved to have won everything here? Yes, but it is important that the Supreme Court at least found that key portions of this law were not okay and should remain blocked at least for 2024. Like, that's not the ideal, but it is an important sign that the Republicans in Arizona have to stop trying to rig these elections.
Mark, with today's Supreme Court ruling, where do we go from here?
So look, this case is going to go forward. The fact that we won today and dodged a bullet in the Supreme Court, we have seen the Republicans are quite relentless when it comes to their voter suppression tactics. So, what we won today was the denial of an emergency stay. So essentially, the Republicans don't get to upset the status quo while the case continues.
Mark, it's fights like these that impact outcomes of elections. Like we said, Arizona has a very recent history of incredibly close elections that have swayed not only the direction of the state, but the direction of the country.
Yeah, look, I mean, President Biden beat Donald Trump by fewer than 11,000 votes in 2020. I mean, it was a safe margin, but it was only 11,000 votes. Governor Hobbs beat Kerry Lake. I mean, Kerry Lake is a complete lunatic, right? She's running for Senate now, and hopefully will lose by a bigger margin. But Katie Hobbs beat Kerry Lake only by 18,000 votes in 2022. If you look at some of the other races that in 2022, like the AG's race, it was even tighter. Of course, it's not just the presidential race, right? It's not just the Senate races. It's these congressional races. It's these other down ballot races. Control of the House of Representatives is like right now depending on the given day, it's like 3-seat margin or 5-seat margin. Well, imagine if you had another black opportunity district in Alabama and Louisiana, another state that that should have been in place for 2022. Imagine if we had fair districts in place in Florida, another state where litigation is ongoing, or in Georgia, right? These things could affect the control of Congress. So when we talk about this margin in Arizona, yes, it's the presidential election. It's also a U.S. Senate race. It's also congressional races. And when you multiply out the Arizonas, this case got a lot of attention because it's for the U.S. Supreme Court. But how many cases, Paige, have you and I talked about around the country, in Nevada, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Montana, in Ohio, right? These fights are taking place all over the place. New York, we did a video recently about a huge victory that Democrats had and Republicans suffered in New York that kind of impacts for Congress. In state after state, the story is the same, which is that Republicans don't want voters to be able to vote. They don't want their ballots to be able to count because they know that is one of the keys for them to maintain power, political power, when in fact they don't enjoy majority support among the electorate. Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of Democracy Docket. Please make sure you're subscribed to our free daily and weekly newsletters, where you will be kept up to date on all of the breaking election and litigation news like we saw today. We'll see you next time.